Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to another edition of the M&D Urban Sustainability e-Symposia 2021. This afternoon, we are on the City in Nature webinar series. My name is Nigel, and I'm very pleased to host moderate this session this afternoon. As you may be aware, this is part of a whole series of webinars where we look at city in nature from several different perspectives. We had started off a few weeks ago looking at nature in cities for urban sustainability, and then now we are in the second edition of a look at ecology, different aspects of ecology within the city. We had looked at ecology in cities about a month ago, and today we are looking at ecology for cities. In September, we will be looking at ecology of cities. So just to give you an overview of the whole webinar series. This afternoon is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker for this Ecology for Cities seminar. And his name is Mr. Cheong Hwee. He's Director of Park Planning in NParks. Previously, he was at the Urban Redevelopment Authority for about 10 years and also in the private sector. Most recently, Hwee seems to have gravitated in his work towards nature. He's looked at planning of the Mandai Mangrove and Mudflat Nature Park, also the Khatib Bongsu Nature Park, as well as Sungai Buloh Nature Park Network, as well as the Bukit Batok Nature Corridor. Without further ado, I'll pass the time over to Hwee for him to share his insights and his experience with us. Hwee, please.
Thank you, Nigel. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hwee, and I'm with the Policy and Planning Division in National Parks Board. Let me bring up my presentation slides. Okay. So today I'll be sharing with you how we go about planning our city in nature in terms of greenery, parks, and also biodiversity. This is my presentation outline. First of all, I would like to set the baseline, which form the basis of our presentation and our discussion today. Not so long ago, just prior to the founding of modern Singapore in 1819, Singapore was actually a green tapestry of primary lowland dictyrocarp forests, secondary forests, freshwater swamps, mangroves, rivers, and grasslands, etc. But by 1900s, more than 90% of the primary forests had been cleared for timber extraction, agriculture, and creation of settlements. And most of these areas that were actually designated as forest reserves then were replaced by the various plantations that sprouted out, and agricultural users were actually taking out all these forested areas as well. So only small reserves of forests were actually scattered across the island. As we all know, Singapore is a very unique city-state where our land use planning strategies needs to concurrently cater to the needs of both a city and a country. We are much smaller compared to other cities such as London, New York, and also Hong Kong. And typically, activities sited outside of cities have to be accommodated within Singapore's limited land areas, such as some of these uses, such as airports, reservoirs, and power stations. And with our limited land and sea space, we also need to cater to the varied needs of a sovereign nation and city, including housing, defense, and also spaces for greenery and parks. Because we are a very small city-state with a very limited land area of about 730 square kilometers, we need to plan carefully and judiciously so that we could safeguard enough land for our medium to long-term needs. And in Singapore, we take a very long-term and careful planning approach so that we can meet current needs and also needs of future generations. And given our limited spaces, we need to balance the demands and trade-offs across the various land users, housing, industry, green spaces, infrastructure, community facilities, workplaces, etc., etc. And while doing so, we need to ensure that we have a good quality living environment. So as part of each long-term plan review, we actually have to review the needs for the major land use types and also assess what is our available land supply in the medium to long term. And these reviews actually help to guide our decisions on the intensity of land development and whether there's a need to actually open up new areas and to stage major moves and infrastructure that will help to optimize land use in the longer term. Despite all these challenges that we face, Singapore is actually one of the greenest cities in the world today. This is quite an achievement considering our land constraint and also considering that we have one of the highest population density as compared to other cities in the world. And despite the high population density, limited space, we were able to actually be one of the greenest cities in the world. In terms of the quality of living environment, we are also ranked high ahead of Asian cities such as Tokyo and Hong Kong. And we continue to top Mercer's 21st Quality of Living ranking for Asia. And worldwide, we are actually ranked 25th out of the 231 cities that were surveyed. At the same time, Singapore has rich biodiversity, and we were actually recognized by the UNESCO Sultan Kobo's Prize for our environmental preservation efforts back in 2017. This actually recognizes our efforts to promote biodiversity conservation in a very highly urbanized and land-scarce city-state. This is the state of our green spaces today. We have about 7,800 hectares of green spaces comprising nature reserves, gardens and parks, park connectors, nature areas, and together we are able to achieve a park provision ratio of 0.78 hectares per 1,000 people, and 93% of our households live within a 10-minute walk from our green spaces. So how were we able to do so? Let us look at our journey from garden city to city in nature. It was actually started by then Prime Minister Mr. Lee Kuan Yew back in 1963. He launched our first nationwide tree planting campaign, which sowed the seed for a green Singapore with well-designed and maintained park and open spaces. And he felt that this should be the birthright of all Singaporeans. He wanted to create the best possible living environment for Singaporeans and to also distinguish Singapore from all other developing cities in the region. And he wanted parks to be a social leveler throughout the different sectors in the population. We have actually moved from a garden city to a city in a garden in 2011. And most recently, in 2020, we want to continue to provide a high quality living environment for Singapore and our response to actually transform Singapore into a city in nature. So what's in a city in nature? It's actually a new approach to restore nature back to the city. And we're doing so to ensure that we continue to be livable, sustainable, and well-being is actually being looked into. How do we actually do so? Is through the application of more nature-based solutions that help us to achieve the outcomes of climate resilience, ecological resilience, and social resilience. There are 4 key strategies as listed on the slides. And underlying the 4 strategies are 2 enablers, namely number 1, people, because through the fact that everyone has a role to play in the city in nature. And secondly, digitalization, science and technology, and also working very closely with the industry. Next, I will talk about how we go about planning for greenery and park spaces. These are the different components of greenery that we can see in the form of the roadside greenery, which actually forms the spine of our garden city. And we also have mandated the need to provide internal greenery on the ground level and encourage skyrise greenery through various schemes such as the Skyrise Greenery Incentive Scheme and the large program jointly offered with URA. And through community spaces like community gardens, edible gardens and all, we are able to encourage more community participation in green spaces. And also together with agencies like LTA, PUB, we are also looking at how public infrastructure can be greened out. So this is a typical scene that we can see when we look out of our window every day. We are land scarce, as we have actually stated earlier on, but we have been able to safeguard spaces to provide green buffer and peripheral planting verges along the perimeter of development sites. And also we have safeguarded tree planting along the streets and also along open air parking at street level. And looking at the photo, you could actually see lots of pockets of greenery all around us in our everyday life. Together with the roadside greenery, where trees are planted extensively along the roads to provide shade and to make the roadside more vibrant and to attract biodiversity to the environment. In terms of park spaces, first of all, we have 360 kilometers of park connectors today, and there are 5 continuous loops. We plan to actually extend this to 500 kilometers by 2030, and this will actually incorporate a series of curated recreation trails, which I will talk about next. Firstly, we have the Round Island route, which is a 150 kilometers continuous route that goes around Singapore, running up along the coast and connecting the various natural, cultural, historical, and recreational sites, and serving to link the different communities across Singapore together. So this is how the Round Island route works. And in addition to the Park Connector Network and the Round Island route, we are also in the process of developing a series of curated recreational corridors and trails across Singapore. The intention is to have a matrix, a very comprehensive green matrix throughout Singapore to allow residents in all parts of Singapore to be well connected and seamlessly to our recreational spaces, including the parks, the gardens, and also the nature reserves and nature parks and nature areas. So together, we will actually hope that these recreational spaces allow Singaporeans to be recreating within nature and to also be part of this city in nature vision. I'll now move on to talk about conservation planning. Conservation planning is guided by the National Conservation Master Plan that was actually launched in 2006 and subsequently revised in 2015. The Nature Conservation Master Plan helped to consolidate, coordinate, strengthen, and intensify all the existing biodiversity conservation efforts. First of all, through the conservation of key habitats to safeguard and strengthen the core areas such as the nature reserves at Bukit Timah, Central Catchment, Sungai Buloh, and Labrador, and linking to the rest of the ecologically sensitive areas and core areas such as the Western Catchment, Pulau Ubin, Pulau Tekong, and our Southern Islands. Next is to actually secure and enhance buffer areas around the core areas, which will actually serve as areas both for recreation and also to serve as a natural buffer to the core areas. There are currently about 350 hectares of nature parks, and we will continue to grow these nature parks through different networks and have an additional of 200 hectares of nature parks by 2030. Some of these new nature parks include the redevelopment of the Rifle Range Nature Park and the new Khatib Bangsu Nature Park, which was announced last year. So these are some visions of nature parks that have been opened. The Windsor Nature Park in 2017 and the Thomson Nature Park in 2019. After identifying the core areas and the buffers, we actually hope to link up all these areas through ecological connections. And these will then increase the resilience of these different core and buffer areas through the form of ecological connectors. So ecological connectors could be in the form of an overland bridge, such as the EcoLink at BKE, which was completed in 2019, or in the form of nature ways, such as the Tangling Nature Way that you can see. Nature ways are actually multi-tiered planting, which mimic the forest structure and planted with native trees and plants to facilitate movement of fauna such as birds and butterflies and insects across the different core areas. Over the long term, we aspire to make every road in Singapore a nature way. And by 2030, we hope to achieve 300 kilometers of nature ways. The Lornie Nature Corridor is another example how we created a nature way, a park connector, and a buffer to the central nature catchment. It actually showcases how road was narrowed and reclaimed for greenery and recreation, and also nature was actually restored on part of the road. Rewilding was carried out to create a more naturalistic landscape, and the nature corridor helped to strengthen the ecological resilience of the abutting central catchment nature reserve by protecting the forest edge against the impacts of drying and wind. We are expanding nature park networks as much as possible. After the Central Nature Park Network was announced in 2017, we announced the Sungai Buloh Nature Park Network in 2020 last year. Moving on to the second strategy of habitat enhancement and restoration. This is actually guided by the Forest Restoration Action Plan, which was introduced in 2019. This is a picture showing how forest restoration was actually carried out at Rifle Range Nature Park. And under the same strategies, we are also looking at naturalizing our parks and gardens. This is an example of the Rasal Walk at Lakeside Gardens in Jurong Lake Gardens. And the Rasal Walk actually comprises restored freshwater swamp habitat that was situated along the edge of Jurong Lake, which had more than 50 species of plants. There's also a 300 meters of meandering boardwalk, which enables visitors to get close to the plants, the habitat, and also the water edge. And it meanders through clusters of different palms, Nibong and Sealing Wax palms, and also Rasal plants, which are often found in freshwater swamp habitat. And then the zones are actually created for water birds to feed and forage, and the boardwalk is then connected to adjacent grassland and wetland trails to allow visitors to experience a variety of habitats within a very short walk. Under the species recovery framework, we also target to look at how endemic, rare, or threatened native species could be conserved in Singapore. Currently, we have 67 plant and 10 animal species in the list, and we hope to implement species recovery plans for another 90 plant and 40 animal species by 2030. On this photo, you see two of the species, the cinnamon bush frog and also the Singapore freshwater crab. Also, we want to conserve the germplasm through living collections and seeds, and we have actually established the Singapore Botanic Seed Bank in 2019 to do so. The native germplasm is actually collected from the core biodiversity areas, and these are then propagated and planted in parks and gardens for reintroduction and also to help with the habitat enhancement efforts in some of these spaces. We have also applied research in conservation biology and in planning. One of the examples is to look at how comprehensive surveys and long-term monitoring could be done. And this is an example of how it was done to look at connectivity of the Raffles Banded Langer and also the slow lorries, which is actually crossing the BKE link at Recently, we talk about the ecological profiling exercise, which has been carried out all this while. This is actually extracted from a Straits Times article that was just published on Monday, 2nd of August. The ecological profiling exercise, or EPE for short, is a good example of how we merge science with technology. The step one of the exercise attempts to actually work out the ecological profile of forested remnants in Singapore so that we can better understand their role as biodiversity refuger. Step two is to work out the paths of least resistance using GIS modeling to map out the possible ecological connectivity between the source habitat and core areas. And step three is to work out how the ecological areas could be balanced against the different needs for development. In doing so, we are also involving the scientific community to further strengthen the existing scientific research and data models that we have built up over the years. And we have actually formed a 13-member scientific advisory panel to provide technical inputs to this exercise. And we will also be engaging the broader nature community as part of the URA's long-term plan consultation. Considerations that were taken in the ecological profiling exercise: we want to identify source population and identify the ecological corridors that we have actually explained. And through the exercise, we have actually announced the Bukit Batok Nature Corridor last year in 2020. And also recently, Clementi Nature Corridor. The study actually showed that there's a need to provide and to maintain the ecological connectivity between Clementi Forest and the southern ridges, particularly through the Kent Ridge area. And there was a need to safeguard a sizable portion of Ulu Pandan site as a stepping stone from Clementi towards the southern ridges. And from the Clementi Nature Corridor, we are able to look at recreation opportunities. So this is actually how we have identified the Clementi Nature Trail, which runs along the Sungai Ulu Pandan Park Connector, across Clementi Forest, towards the rail corridor, and then towards the forest stream. It can actually form a loop back along the rail corridor, back to Sungai Ulu Pandan Park Connector. And then we have also identified the old Jurong line, which is a nature trail along the old disused railway line that connects all the way to Jurong Town Hall Road, where we will develop a new park connector to continue the cycling and recreation experience to Jurong Lake Gardens. So effectively, we've actually linked up Jurong Lake Gardens with the rail corridor. The fourth strategy of the Nature Conservation Master Plan is to actually encourage community stewardship and also to carry out outreach in nature conservation. This is actually done through the citizen science under community in nature. And one of the program is the Biodiversity Watch, or a BioBliss program, which helps to engage citizens to monitor our butterfly, dragonfly, and bird species in our parks, gardens, and nature reserves. These are the citizen scientists, we call them, and it has actually grown from 400 citizen scientists in 2015 to over 9,000 in 2020. Another form of community engagement and stewardship is actually through the 1 Million Tree movement, where we engage community not just in tree planting, but also in plant propagation, and also the removal of invasive species that are actually affecting some of these areas. So finally, I would like to talk about the future challenges. We have seen lots of dismay news in the world today. We talk about how Singapore is among the world's major cities to face unprecedented climate conditions by 2050, how temperatures in Singapore could possibly hit 40 degrees Celsius as early as 2045, and how more people and urbanization could be the cause behind the rise in dengue cases in recent years. It has posed us two major changes. One is the climate change, and also the second challenge is the increasing urbanization. So we have asked our questions like how we could mitigate the impacts of climate change and build resilience despite the rising temperatures and rising sea levels. And for increasing urbanization, how we could actually ensure a quality living environment amidst the increasing urbanization. So we hope to actually get some of these solutions through possible research so that we could actually address some of these challenges and the problems that are actually posed by these challenges. And in place of conclusion, I'd like to actually share and talk about how in nature conservation, a lot of it is about balance, especially between humans and wildlife, and particularly so between nature and development in the case of Singapore. We will continue to walk this green journey to enhance our city in nature together with you, the nature community, and also the scientific community. So we hope to see how the scientific community can actually contribute to our efforts, and also the rest of Singapore could actually be a part of this journey. And with this, this is my last slide. I'll be happy to take any questions or comments later during the Q&A segment. Back to you, Nigel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hwee. And yes, thanks for also mentioning the Q&As, which I should have mentioned earlier. Throughout the webinar, anytime you have questions, feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A using the Q&A button that you have at the bottom of your screen. And we will try to address as many of the questions as we can during the Q&A session. Yeah, so, well, we'll go on to our next speaker now, who is Associate Professor Dan Fries. Dan is currently wearing several hats. Besides being Associate Professor in Geography at NUS, he's also the Deputy Director at the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. This is a very new center that has recently been set up to deal with this issue of climate change in Singapore. Dan is also lead PI for the NRF-funded project that is assessing Singapore's natural capital. And this is the first time that we are doing this in Singapore for terrestrial, coastal, and marine habitats and their ecosystem services that they provide. So you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to the speakers. So without further ado, Dan, please share with us what you have. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to talk to you today. I'm Dan Fries from the National University of Singapore, and I'm going to talk on the topic of harnessing urban natural capital for decision making. Now, if we want to harness the power of urban natural capital, the first thing we need to do is to be able to quantify it. And this is really what we've been working on for a couple of years now, particularly in Singapore. But before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that a lot of the work you're about to see is not my work. I'm just lucky enough to be able to present it to you today, but it's really the hard work of a number of different people, and particularly two groups I'd like to acknowledge. First of all, our Natural Capital Singapore group. This is a project funded by NRF that ended just last month, and it involved over 60 researchers and students from Singapore ETH Centre, from NUS, from NTU, from QUGE, as well as a number of other government stakeholders. So you'll see some of their work, and also you'll see work from the Mangrove Lab in Geography Department at NUS. So just to acknowledge their contributions up front. So before I get into quantifying Singapore's urban natural capital, I thought it might be good just to take a step back and introduce a couple of concepts. For example, what is natural capital? Well, natural capital is really just the environment around us. It's our stock of natural resources. It's a way of estimating our natural assets. And this natural capital is producing ecosystem services or benefits that we derive from the environment every day. And this slide just shows a couple of examples that we benefit from here in Singapore. And so this natural capital is producing these ecosystem services every day. And we classify them into a couple of different kind of baskets. First of all, the provisioning services. These are things that we directly extract from the ecosystem, such as fish or fuel wood. We have regulating services, and these are benefits that we derive when some kind of ecosystem or natural process is regulated, such as wave energy being reduced to help with coastal protection. And then we have this basket of cultural services, and these stretch all the way from very tangible services such as recreation and tourism, all the way to some very abstract and intangible services such as spiritual value or cultural heritage. And so we start with our natural capital, our ecosystem, the habitats, but also aspects of the abiotic environment. They are producing what we call intermediate services or ecosystem functions every day. Forests are photosynthesizing, they're sequestering carbon, and they would do that whether or not people are involved. But it's when people are involved that they become an ecosystem service. And when we derive benefit from that, it becomes a goods or benefit. So I'll give you an example. We have a secondary rainforest that's just naturally sucking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That provides an ecosystem service because it helps to regulate the global climate. And the benefit that we derive is protection from or mitigation of climate change. Now, this ecosystem service concept is relatively new. We've been using it for about 20 years now. But actually, Singapore is a fantastic case study for how we've been utilizing ecosystem services for decades, if not centuries. And so in 1879, we see a quote from an engineer that talked about keeping a forest reserve at the summit of Bukit Timah for climatic purposes. And really since the 60s and kind of the garden city planning philosophy, really quite explicitly used what we would now call ecosystem services in terms of make aesthetic appeal, looking good, in terms of protecting our watersheds and water flows, and also for tourism, and to really to attract people to Singapore. So we've been using this concept of ecosystem services for a very long time. But the question we have now is, how can we measure and value the benefits of Singapore's ecosystem services today? And how can that help then with planning and development? So to answer that question, there's a couple of steps. First of all, we need to know where our natural capital even is and what its distribution is and what different habitats and ecosystems we have. And we have a pretty good idea of that now. This is a map of Singapore's terrestrial and marine environments and their distribution. The terrestrial data dates from about 2018, so it's pretty up to date. And this gives us an idea of where our different natural and managed habitats are. Once we know that, we can then develop a series of models or go out and measure different ecosystem services. And this is really what we did in the Natural Capital Singapore project. We took this group of ecosystems that we'd mapped, and for each of them, we quantified a range of different ecosystem services that you can see here. And so I'm just going to give you a few examples. The project measured numerous different combinations of those ecosystems and services, but I'm just going to give you a few kind of highlights. And the first one is regulating the global climate. Carbon is a really hot topic at the moment, particularly after the United Nations Paris Agreement, where a lot of countries have to submit information to the UN on carbon fluxes and emissions. But also a number of cities are taking the lead in measuring their climate change impact as well. And we can use our natural vegetation to mitigate some of our greenhouse gas emissions through carbon sequestration. And we've been able to quantify this for a couple of different ecosystems. And we know generally for Singapore, when we take into account, for example, the price of carbon taxes and credits, the carbon sequestration by our vegetation is worth about $2 million per year. And some ecosystems are really good at doing this. And I want to highlight mangroves here, because mangroves, because of their waterlogged soils, are able to store carbon at really high densities, much higher than other forest types. And so even though our mangroves only cover a few hundred hectares, they're able to store more than 1.6 million tons of carbon dioxide, particularly in their soils. And the map here just is an example of the national scale map that we've created. And you can see that different mangroves have different densities of carbon. Another really important ecosystem service that we hear a lot about in Singapore is the ability of vegetation to cool the urban climate or to reduce the urban heat island effect. And this, Singapore is a really great case study for this. And I think we're one of the most modeled cities in the world in terms of climate, and a lot of different groups and people working on this. So we have a really good idea now of the role that natural and managed vegetation plays in reducing air temperatures in urban environments. And you can see from this satellite image, shows very clearly the differences in temperatures in 2015. And you can spot quite clearly where the cooler areas are. These are areas of natural habitats, such as the central catchment and western catchment areas. A service that we don't talk a lot about in Singapore, but we're starting to more and more, particularly after the National Day rally in 2019 and putting kind of climate change adaptation really at the forefront. We've now started to talk about how ecosystems may be able to be a nature-based solution to climate adaptation as well as other natural hazards. And this is an example of mangroves doing this. Their dense above-ground roots are able to basically act as a sponge or a buffer to incoming wave energy. So they can protect our shorelines from waves. And this graph here shows that during storms, some of our mangrove patches in Singapore are able to reduce wave heights by more than 75%. And interestingly, you don't need a huge amount of mangrove to be able to get this benefit. And then there's a whole set of kind of cultural ecosystem service values that we've been working on over the years. And I just want to highlight one of them here. The fact that we can really quantify the economic value of recreation in Singapore. Now, recreation is really important because it's a chance for us to get outside. It improves our physical and mental health and well-being. And I think we've all realized this after the lockdowns due to COVID, and how important it is to access green space. And we've been in the Natural Capital Singapore project using a range of different techniques to try and get a handle on cultural ecosystem services. They're not nearly as easy to measure as carbon or some of these other services. So we have to come up with some innovative and big data solutions to do this. And this was a study that was used anonymized mobile phone information to see where people were coming from to visit various recreational areas in Singapore. And we were able to quantify a value from that information. And we were able to show that the Bukit Nature Reserve is worth up to $9 million per year. And Jurong Lake Garden is able to contribute up to $67 million per year. So we can use these novel big data techniques to get a handle on visitor rates and values. Okay, so we create all of these models and data layers, but what do we actually use them for? What are, can they be used, and how can they help inform decision making? And so I'll give you just one example. There's a number of different projects that we've done on this, but this is the example of Tenga Forest Town, which will be developed over the coming years. And we were able to take the plans from that development study and try and estimate what some of the implications for natural capital would be. And so we can create models or use our existing models to show changes in carbon sequestration, changes in urban heat island effect, etc. And you can see that a forest town such as Tenga will have positive and negative implications for ecosystem services. But we can use this sort of information to kind of fine-tune developments and understand the consequences of different management actions. Now, a lot of that I presented to you is on the kind of the supply side, how much natural capital is being produced. But there's also the other side of it, the demand side, where people are demanding different ecosystem services. And so we wanted to get a handle on that as well. And we were able to do that through a number of different studies, including doing large national scale surveys of why what aspects of the environment were important to different people. And through these surveys, we saw that, first of all, there was quite an emerging knowledge of ecosystem services from a lot of different people and a lot of different groups, but also that there were particular services that were highly valued in Singapore. And the top three were temperature reduction, improvement of mental health and well-being, and air purification. And these are really highly valued by different groups. And it makes sense, right? Singapore is very hot, and we use vegetation a lot for shading and reducing temperatures anyways. There's a lot of discussion now about how green spaces can improve mental health, and then the air purification benefits we've seen through the haze, for example, over a couple of years. That this is again something that's on people's minds quite a lot, and people are interested to know how the environment may be able to help with some of these issues. But we're starting to see in the last year or two some even more obvious signs that people care about ecosystem services. And to highlight this, I want to show this petition that was raised by a member of the public to campaign to protect Dover Forest. And what was really striking for me about this petition was that 9 reasons were given for why Dover Forest should be protected, and only one of them was about biodiversity. And actually 8 of the 9 were explicitly about ecosystem services. So I think it also shows that ecosystem services is a good way to connect with a range of different stakeholders that might not always be involved in kind of land use planning or environmental aspects. And we've seen this throughout our projects now that when we speak to the media, it's really about ecosystem services, and that seems to resonate with readers and viewers a lot more. And so I've just got a few examples here. Through our projects, we've done a number of documentaries with Channel News Asia, a number of commentaries, etc. And we've even had our work shared by the then DPM. I was really surprised to see our work on mangrove carbon being read and shared at those kind of levels. But when it gets shared by somebody in that position, a lot of people read it, and so it really helps us to access and share the importance of our environment with a range of different stakeholders. And I think ecosystem services is just a really useful and accessible way of talking about the importance of our natural and managed environments. And so to summarize, I think that Singapore is quite a unique and really important living laboratory for ecosystem services. And we're in that position because we can build upon decades of thinking and work on ecosystem services. Today, we now have a pretty good idea of where our natural capital is and the value and the wide range of benefits that it's producing. And finally, we really do think that ecosystem services and natural capital, which are concepts that we're hearing so much about over the last year or two, and we're hearing a lot about it because it is a really accessible way to connect with a range of kind of non-traditional stakeholders who might not normally be involved in environmental discussions. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. And I just want to encourage the questions that have been coming in the chat are great questions. I want to encourage everyone to continue typing those questions. We will deal with them at the end of the next presentation. Please keep those questions coming, because I can see already from the questions that we're going to have a very good Q&A discussion later on. So next up, we have a combined presentation by Dr. Karenne Thun and Mr. Jonathan Tan. Karenne has spent 18 years within academia, non-profit organizations, as well as in private environmental consultancy. And she has been personally very concerned at the rapid decline of coastal ecosystems, especially within the region. Right now, Karenne is responsible for several things, including managing Singapore's first marine park at the Sisters Islands. Jonathan works with Karenne, and he's looking into research such as one key research project that he's involved in is the Southern Islands Biodiversity Survey. In fact, he's leading that survey. He is also looking at specific programs for the hawksbill turtle. I guess most of us in this seminar will know that we do have hawksbill turtles in Singapore. And we have recently rediscovered the Neptune's cup sponge, which was thought to be extinct for a very long time. So he has particular interest in the ecology of artificial shorelines. So with this combination, Karenne and Jonathan, will you take it away? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nigel, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm Karenne, and together with my co-presenter, Jonathan, we are from the National Biodiversity Centre at NParks. We would like to start by thanking the organizers for the opportunity to present at this MND R&D Symposia. Next slide, please. So in this presentation, I will cover the first point, and my colleague Jonathan will then take you through nature-based solutions, share on examples from Singapore, and highlight knowledge gaps that we still need to address. Next slide, please. Right, so during the National Day rally in 2019, Prime Minister Lee sounded the alarm on the impending threats of climate change. He said that climate change is one of the gravest challenges the human race faces, and Singapore is already feeling the impacts, which is likely to worsen over the next few decades. The fact is, Singapore is not insulated from the impacts of climate change, and we actually need to respond and adapt to these challenges. And one of the first ones to look at is rising temperatures. So over the last 4 decades, from 1980 to about 2020, the annual mean temperature increased from 26.9 to 28 degrees, with a maximum daily temperature predicted to reach 35 to 37 degrees. And I think some numbers even got to 45 degrees. The rising temperature will inadvertently contribute to the urban heat island effect that Dr. Dan Fries mentioned earlier, a situation that actually gets amplified in small urbanized islands like Singapore. Now, although rising temperatures are mainly felt on land, it also drives oceans to absorb more heat, resulting in increased sea surface temperatures, which in turn is predicted to affect ocean circulation patterns and impact coastal and marine ecosystems. Now, the second impact is extreme weather. Rainfall has also become more intense in recent years, with the intensity and frequency increasing at a pace that many have not experienced even just a few decades ago. The total annual rainfall for Singapore has increased at an average rate of 67 millimeters per decade over the last 4 decades, and is projected to continue on this trajectory in the coming decades. The third impact is rising sea levels. Now, the mean sea level in the Singapore Straits has increased at the rate of about 1.2 to 1.7 millimeter per year between 1975 to 2009. What that means is the average sea level around Singapore has actually risen by 14 centimeters above pre-1970 levels. And by 2100, sea level rise is projected to increase by another 1 meter or more. So now these impacts may seem abstract and unfamiliar to many people, but we cannot wait for them to manifest before we respond. So climate change is an existential threat that requires proactive and upstream planning. And in recent years, the spotlight has really focused on the opportunities offered by nature-based solutions to help us address socio-environmental challenges like climate change. Next slide, please. Right, so to leverage on the benefits of nature-based solutions, we need to know what we are protecting and where, what beneficial uses we hope to derive from these solutions, and the underlying socio-geo-environmental conditions that will determine what typologies may be suitable for different coastal areas. Next slide, please. And in Singapore, we already start with the Singapore Master Plan, a land use plan which guides Singapore development in the medium term over 10 to 15 years. And this map shown here is the 2019 Master Plan. So what we can see from the map is that much of Singapore is urbanized. We do have some green patches, the green heart of Singapore, and on the western side, the green arm, with development abutting much of our coastline. Now, for us to harness the benefits of nature-based solutions, we also need to know the current shoreline typologies along the coast. Next slide, please. Using a mosaic of satellite maps with extensive ground truthing, we generated habitat maps for Singapore. And as you can see from this map, there are still coastal and marine habitats distributed around Singapore, but then we also realize that many of them exist as very narrow slivers. This is similar to what Dan presented earlier in his slides. Next slide, please. Now, when we overlay various shoreline typologies, we can see that majority of Singapore's coastline is already protected by fixed engineered structures. About 70% of our coastline is engineered, which themselves need to be further protected against rising sea levels and climate change. Next slide, please. So this is a 2019 flood map of Singapore, and it shows that without any intervention, right, if we project climate change to 2100, significant areas in Singapore along our coast and inland will be flooded by extreme storm events. And of course, this is something that we need to address. And that's why a lot of the strategies revolve around understanding what the projected sea level rise might impact Singapore. Next slide, please. So how do we deal with flooding? So for a small island state like Singapore, we need to address flooding holistically and with solutions that simultaneously address both inland and coastal flooding. And this needs an integrated system, which our water agency, PUB, is already currently spearheading. However, when we talk about protection along the coast, we need to look at two aspects: inundation and erosion. Next slide, please. So inundation is driven by three main factors: sea level rise, and in the case of Singapore, that's about 1 meter by 2100, more frequent and intense storm surges, and the natural variability of our tidal cycles, which can rise as much as 3.5 meters during the highest high spring tides. And even as we develop strategies to protect our coastline from inundation, we need to continue to keep our focus on erosion, which is a constant process driven by wave action, storms, and shipwrecks. So our challenge really is, as we start on this coastal protection journey, to identify strategies to help us achieve our goals in a sustainable way, harness new opportunities, and in the process, create multiple use benefits. And we believe that the creative use of nature-based solutions can help us provide these answers. And my colleague Jonathan will now share more about this. Jonathan, please.
Thanks, Karenne. So as Karenne mentioned, the approach that MParks is hoping to promote is the consideration of nature-based solutions rather than traditional engineering solutions in order to help with coastal protection in the face of sea level rise. So some background to this is that earlier this year, the SG Green Plan 2030 was launched. And within this, city in nature is one of its 5 pillars. And city in nature goes beyond just tree planting. It's actually a whole of Singapore strategy to enhance and extend our natural capital. Beyond planting trees, we are also doing things like adding new parks and green spaces, as well as enhancing existing parks. And the idea is to have city in nature be one of our key strategies to build resilience against climate change using nature-based solutions. So traditional coastal protection strategies rely exclusively on hard infrastructure, concrete. So they look like things like your traditional seawalls or your tidal gates, and they are actually very effective in fulfilling the function of coastal protection. The downside is that they tend to have limited or even no biodiversity value, although with careful planning and integration with park spaces, they can have recreational value, such as marina barrage. Another downside to traditional solutions is that they're not able to self-repair or grow with sea level rise because they are non-living. So this is where nature-based solutions come in. And I think the first question we do need to answer is what nature-based solutions are. So NBS or nature-based solutions are things that tap on natural systems in order to address challenges that society faces in ways that are effective as well as adaptive, meaning that as conditions change with climate change, these solutions may be able to grow in turn and better adapt to increased sea level rises. These solutions should also provide additional co-benefits such as for human well-being as well as biodiversity. And we can make use of them by, where possible, protecting, sustainably managing, or restoring natural ecosystems. In cases where hard engineering solutions are inevitable, we can then work to soften them up with natural elements so that they can have increased recreational and biodiversity value. Now, the next question is, why should we use NBS when traditional solutions already work so well? Well, firstly, we are able to solve multiple problems with NBS. Beyond just flood and coastal protection, NBS can also provide social or recreational spaces and continue to build up ecological resilience in the face of climate change. There's also a strong economic case for NBS because they are potentially cheaper to build and maintain versus your traditional hard solutions. And when you consider the fact that they have multiple users, this further increases the cost-benefit returns of NBS. One good example is Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park, which actually costs less in order to build a floodplain there versus a traditional storm drain, and it provided higher returns because of the social values that people attach to it. Additionally, NBS have potential to grow with or adapt to sea level rise because they are living ecosystems, such as mangroves, coral reefs, and seagrass meadows. So what kind of NBS are we talking about when we look at Singapore? I think first we need to recognize the constraints that we have, which is that we have very limited land and sea space. So we can't really advance the shoreline that much, nor can we afford to retreat and allow sea levels to flood our inland areas. This does mean that soft NBS to prevent coastal inundation like sand dunes are generally not feasible because of the high land take required. And most of the NBS we need to protect ourselves against inundation will be hard or hybrid eco-engineering. So for instance, where there are critical assets like the airport or industrial estates, you might need to use seawalls because of the relatively less land take that they use. And then we soften them up to add some recreational and ecological value. And in places where the users are more recreational, such as parks, we can use more hybrid systems such as upper beach berms with lagoons and offshore reefs. There is also some space for soft NBS such as mangroves in order to mitigate erosion, but you need a harder edge inland to prevent inundation from happening. So the kind of NBS that we can consider for Singapore ranges from the very hard, where you are putting enhancement elements onto a seawall, all the way to hybrid and then soft NBS, which essentially are natural ecosystems. So I'll just now give a brief overview of existing coastal NBS that have been used in Singapore. One experimental kind of NBS is seawall enhancement. So this involves putting artificial tidal pools or biodiversity enhancement tiles onto existing seawalls so that they can become more amenable for biodiversity to recolonize the wall. These tend to be placed at the higher shore, where they're more accessible or visible to people, but they're largely experimental or pilot projects. Another kind of NBS is floating reefs. So for instance, at Marina at Keppel Bay, this marina was actually built to allow currents to flow freely through, bringing in nutrients and larvae so that corals are able to settle naturally onto the floating reefs. This has then in turn attracted a variety of species such as seahorses and sea turtles, and increases the overall biodiversity value of the area, which would otherwise be sterile seawall. There are also artificial reefs, such as at Sisters Islands, where JTC installed 8 multi-story reefs inside Sisters Islands Marine Park. And within a few months, they were quickly overgrown with algae and sponges, which then attracted a wide variety of fishes. Within a year, new corals naturally recruited onto the reef, and we have also facilitated the transplantation of mature corals onto these reefs. These were originally designed to minimize impact on the hydrodynamics of the area, but future units could be designed to instead have some kind of wave attenuation function. Moving on to mangroves. Over at Pulau Tekong, we have the largest pristine patch of mangrove in Singapore. And more than 10 years ago, it was found that this stretch of mangrove was suffering from severe erosion. So in order to fix this issue, NParks actually pioneered a hybrid rock mangrove revertment in 2011, and this successfully arrested the erosion of the mangrove forest. The revertment was also designed in a way to allow the planting of mangrove saplings in the gaps amongst the rocks of the revertment, and to allow natural recolonization by mangrove saplings. And as you can see from the photo in the bottom right corner, many new mangrove saplings are now growing along the rock wall. There's also mangrove river naturalization. So throughout Singapore, many mangrove rivers have been linearized and cleared. Some of these have regenerated on their own, such as at Belaya Creek or Sungai Pangsua, but there are also deliberate naturalization projects that the government has undertaken. For instance, in the 1980s, HDB and PUB worked together in order to naturalize Sungai Api-Api, and today we have a natural mangrove river that flows through a HDB estate. Mangrove planting is something else that has a long history in Singapore. So for instance, during the 90s when Semakau landfill was built, it actually resulted in the loss of a lot of mangroves. And as compensation for this loss, the seabed was raised to create 2 new mudflat plots that were protected by a rock bund. More than 400,000 mangrove saplings were planted by NEA, and today it has formed a great wall of mangrove roots, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, which may actually serve some wave attenuation and erosion control function, although more study is needed. NParks has also been doing mangrove planting in places like Sungai Buloh Wetland Reserve in order to restore the ecosystem there. Kind of like related to mangrove planting is mangrove restoration through natural ecological means, where you just inundate an area and allow the tides to bring in mangrove saplings naturally. So this was done at Pasir Ris Park, and NParks is also working with the community to implement this on Pulau Ubin. Besides these so-called deliberate NBS that have been implemented in the past, there are also accidental NBS that have happened in Singapore, which we could potentially learn from as we continue to adapt to climate change. So for instance, seawall reefs. So quite a number of seawalls and revertments throughout Singapore, including both on the mainland as well as in the southern islands, have become colonized by a high diversity and density of hard corals because of the stable substrate that the seawall provides. These seawalls were not originally designed for coral reefs to settle on, but there are principles we can learn from them that might allow us to replicate them deliberately in future. For instance, we now understand that when a seawall has a gentler incline, it's likely to support more coral, and that the highest coral densities are found generally from the depth of 0 to 3 meters. So if we can maximize such seawall designs going forward, we can then have coral reefs growing along all our protected coasts. These coral reefs then in turn have some potential to attenuate wave action and protect the coastline from erosion. Another kind of accidental nature-based solution is perch beach, reclaimed lagoons, and tidal flats that we see at outlet drains. So most of these areas were actually formerly reclaimed, and various coastal protection structures were then built. So for instance, if you look at Marina East at the bottom left corner, you will see this long submerged breakwater off the beach. And if you look at, for instance, the photo on the bottom right, that's Kusu Island, which after reclamation actually had some protected lagoons that were created to prevent erosion. However, after these places were left for a few decades, they were then colonized with rich biodiversity, such as seagrasses and coral reefs. And if you look at the next slide, you will see that this wide variety of diverse marine life that have actually settled on these artificial shores. So with the right design, we could potentially learn from these accidental case studies and figure out how to replicate them in other parts of Singapore. Now, besides what NParks has managed to learn from observation, we do also want to find out from participants what you guys think the gaps in nature-based solutions are, because many of these solutions were not originally designed to deal with climate change. And there are many questions that remain when it comes to, for instance, how much erosion protection these ecosystems can provide us, how well they can keep pace with rising sea levels, and if natural ecosystems can't stop inundation, how do we better integrate them with hard engineering solutions that are able to? NParks and other government agencies will be working to address these questions through research programs, such as the Marine Climate Change Science Program, or MCCS, as well as the City and Nature pillar of the Cities of Tomorrow R&D program. But we would also like to welcome your feedback and send in your ideas of the challenges and the opportunities that you think you might observe when it comes to coastal NBS at the email that is on the bottom right-hand corner. So all in all, some of the key takeaways that we hope that you will have from today is, firstly, that NBS cannot offer multiple co-benefits over traditional solutions. And also recognizing the constraints that we have in Singapore, most NBS here will likely be hybrid or hard eco-engineering. Inevitably, because of our small land area and because of the high amount of urbanization we have, we will need hard barriers like seawalls or tidal gates to prevent inundation of our inland areas, but we can work to soften them with natural elements. And one very valuable lesson we've learned from all the accidental case studies that I mentioned is that if we build things right, biodiversity will come back on its own for free for all to enjoy. We will, however, continue to need more research and development to build the knowledge base necessary to deploy these NBS effectively and deliberately. If you'd like to find out more about the work that NParks is doing to make Singapore our city in nature, you can follow us on these various social media platforms. And thank you for listening to our talk today.
Thank you very much, Jonathan and Karenne. Looking at those pictures brings back very fond memories for me. I started off my research career in marine ecology actually, so that really brings back memories. Okay, so and thank you very much, all three speakers. We are moving into the last but most exciting portion of this webinar, and that is the question and answer session. I'd like to invite the panelists to come and join me on screen, I suppose. We're all in different places, but so that we can address questions that have been raised and also follow-up questions surrounding them. I don't think we have the time to address all the questions properly, but I'd like to sort of like remind ourselves that this seminar, though very wide-ranging, is focused on ecology for cities. So that aspect is the one that I would like to focus all our attention on this evening as we look at some of the questions that came up. Okay, so one question that came up quite early was on the industry and business and how they can be part of the solution. I think that's a very insightful question because it identifies the fact that there are different components of the ecosystem, and the ecosystem doesn't just comprise of the plants and the animals and those of us in academia or in NParks dealing with these issues, but also normal Singaporeans as well as businesses and companies that are there to make money, which is not a bad thing in itself. So my question to the panelists is really what do you think? How do you think business can go beyond what they're doing today, beyond corporate social responsibility? Is there potential for businesses to mainstream what they're doing to align, not perhaps not directly be a positive support or a factor for conservation and ecology of the city, but as they do their work, a portion of their work will also contribute towards this goal of nature-based solutions or basically sustainability in the city, right? So yeah, maybe I'll simplify the question a little bit. So how do panelists think that business can go beyond CSR and mainstream their core activities, more of their core activities into supporting city in nature? Yes, so maybe I'll start with Hwee, and then we'll go on to Karenne and Jonathan, and then I'll let Dan kind of wrap up. Yeah. Yes. Sorry, put you on the spot, Hwee, but I think you are up there with your caffeine fix already. Thanks, Hwee.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. I had this feeling that it's going to be paused to me. I mean, off my cuff, I'm just thinking about how actually Skyrise Greenery became very popular in the last couple of decades. So initially, I recall when I first joined NParks, I understand NParks actually did a lot of research to find out which are the sustainable and cheaper methods of irrigation and the type of plants that can actually grow well on vertical greenery or rooftop greenery. And with the amount of research that was actually done, I think there was actually a lot of buy-in subsequently, because at the end of the day, the industry is interested about costs, keeping costs low, keeping the maintenance costs low, etc. So it was together, I think, with incentive programs that we have actually launched together with the scheme through the Skyrise Greenery Incentive Scheme, through the large program that URA has, etc. We actually managed to sell the idea, and then there was actually grounds up support for Skyrise Greenery as well. And I think today, it seems like Skyrise Greenery has been taken more or less like a default for lots of private developments, and we see lots of condo advertisements that have they are actually selling greenery as part of the package of condo living. So it's actually a chicken and egg thing, I think. So the industry needs to get buy-in, but the government on our part will need to make it cheaper for the industry to actually enter the market. So this is actually an example off my head. Yeah, maybe I'll leave some time for the other speakers.
So maybe I'll go next, since Nigel mentioned my name. But maybe just to add to what Prof was saying, you know, nature is a common good, right? Basically, it's there, belongs to all of us. And perhaps what companies can do internally, and we see some examples over the years, is to get their staff, you know, to be more engaged. Not just through donations, but also physically engaged in activities. And I know that there are some companies who allow their staff 3 days of a year to be involved in programs, to volunteer in various programs. And I think that's actually a good start, because only when they are actually physically involved and contributing, then the impacts of what they're doing is better realized. So not many companies do that, I think, and that would be one good way to, I guess, get the buy-in from more people into some of these strategies. So just wanted to share that, and I'll leave the rest some time to focus on other areas. Thank you.
Dan, could you share your wisdom with us?
Sure. I think one thing that's important for a lot of businesses are realizing now is that it makes good business sense to incorporate the environment into their processes and planning. And I mean, I never thought I would be having the sort of conversations I'm having with banks and shipping companies and agricultural companies, all sorts of groups who are interested in, you know, using natural capital for offsetting for example, for carbon credits and things like that. And yeah, and Singapore is going to become a really big hub for the trade of these kind of things. And so, so many businesses now are interested in this because of all of their kind of net zero targets. And so I think we're only going to see more and more companies getting involved. And it's been a really interesting experience to chat with all of these stakeholders that I never thought would be interested in mangrove carbon or something, and now they are, and they're interested in it in quite a genuine way. I think I don't think it is always kind of greenwashing and things. I think companies see that all the other companies, and this is where business is going, and they want to be first movers in that. So I think businesses have a really important role to play in conservation and restoration in the future.
Okay, thanks, Dan, Karenne, and Hwee. Maybe I'll move on a little bit more to this idea arising from a question about Singapore being a role model. And just to give you all a heads up, I'm going to ask the questions to all three of you again. So there was a very specific question of whether Singapore's model in nature-based solutions, natural capital, and so on can be replicated in Accra, which is in Africa. I'm going to sort of generalize this question a little bit because I'm not sure if our panelists are familiar with Accra itself, but can what we do here in Singapore be adapted? I won't say replicated because I don't think replication would work because there's always local conditions. But can it be adapted usefully in other tropical cities? What can Singapore export in terms of outputs and outcomes arising from all this knowledge work that we've been doing over the years? Is there something worthwhile? What would you package in an export of such knowledge that we have built up over the years? Yeah, I will leave any of you to come in as you will. I won't arrow Hwee again. All right.
I've unmuted myself.
Okay. Well, if you volunteer, Hwee, please go ahead. Yes.
I thought you're going to call me first, Tress. No, but seriously, I think this is $1 million question. If I had known an answer, I think I would probably be a millionaire in a couple of years' time. But really, I think there are things that Singapore has learned and we can share with the rest of the world. Of course, many things that we do in Singapore is actually contextual because we are a tropical city. And some of these things may not be absolutely relevant and transplantable to other cities in other parts of the world. But I think the principles, the approach, the strategies that we adopt are things which I think we will be happy to share with any cities in the world. Similarly, that's how we have actually shared the greening journey with many Chinese cities. And for those of you who have been to Chinese cities in the recent decade, you will actually see how green Chinese cities have actually become. So I think there will be things that we can actually share with the rest of the world as well. I'll just keep it general as that, and I'll leave it to my other speakers.
Okay, any one of the other three, feel free to jump in.
Okay, I'll jump in now. Just to add on to what Prof was saying, I mean, it is not always easy to replicate what we're doing here, but like what he says, you can replicate the approach and the strategies. One good example is governance and planning strategies that Singapore has. That is something that we could share. And just for those who are interested, we have captured some of these in a resource called the Integrated Urban Coastal Management resource. So basically that framework talks about how a whole of government approach can be taken to address some of the key issues along the coast, integrating knowledge through the research that's done by academia, and also to bring in the community into this. As what Hwee mentioned, the Nature Conservation Master Plan captures that, but specifically for the coastal environment, the Integrated Urban Coastal Management Framework tries to articulate some of these in key examples. So that's something that if people are interested, this document is downloadable online. Thank you.
maybe I'll jump in here and specifically direct the question to Jonathan. Yes, Jonathan. Yeah, all of them are going to come after me after this seminar. But Jonathan, Karenne mentioned the IUCM, the Integrated Urban Coastal Management model or process. And that kind of brings in that word urban again. And the question that I have for you, John, is we have the Sisters Island Marine Park, of which you are very much a part of. At the same time, we are very aware that this marine park is right smack within port limits of one of the world's busiest ports. So how is that an oxymoron? Is that something that's not supposed to happen? You know, marine parks are supposed to be in undisturbed areas, but we have our marine park with I don't know how many ships passing by every day. What are some of your thoughts on that? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel, for that question. I think it closely ties to the fact that we aspire to be a city in nature, right? That while traditionally you set aside national parks or marine reserves in very pristine areas, the issue with doing that is that these places are very far away from urban centers where most people are living, which then limits the kind of ecosystem value that ecosystem service value that people can derive from it, because it's difficult for people to visit. If you are visiting it, it's likely that you have a certain kind of affluence. You have the money to go and travel there. But on the other hand, having a marine park or reserve, or in fact, even nature reserve, right, on the terrestrial side, being integrated into the urban matrix and easily accessible to the urban population means that the ecosystem service value they derive from it is really high, right? So even those Sisters Islands, in terms of diversity, it cannot compare to, for instance, the Great Barrier Reef, in terms of size or the number of species. But the fact that it's so easily accessible to people living in Singapore means that its value is actually very high to us, because anyone can just take a half-day trip and visit it without having to take a plane, without even having to take more than a half-hour boat ride. Yeah.
Okay. Dan, any thoughts on that question about yeah.
Sure, about kind of applicability. When we were starting our Natural Capital Singapore project, this was the #1 question on our mind. Are we creating a study just for Singapore or for something that is bigger than that? And I think what we tried to focus on was to create a framework that could be transferred. As everybody's mentioned, replicating it might not work because Singapore is, in many respects, is unique from many other places. But at least a checklist of what needs to be done, right? One, you should survey people to actually understand what ecosystem services they want. #2, we came up with a kind of a systematic classification, so we know what sort of ecosystem services are important in an urban habitat. We even came up with definitions of what certain urban habitats are, because a lot of these ecosystem service assessments are based on rural areas or more natural habitats. And so even just, those are the frameworks that can then be taken to another place, but at least kind of the steps that you need to go. And I think that's what, because we have so many decades of experience doing this in Singapore, I think that's the real benefit of what we can export. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Dan, Jonathan, Karenne, and Hwee. Okay, I'll go on to, there were some questions in the chat earlier about water scarcity, also about food. And I'd like to juxtapose that a little bit with the idea of nature that we're talking about here in City in Nature. So to the panelists, how do you put all those things together? There's food, there's water scarcity, there's nature, and of course, we're talking about urbanity, right? Is there such a word? being in an urban environment, what does the word integrated mean in the light of all these diverse needs that we are facing? Some thoughts from the panelists. Any one of you? Okay, I won't require all of you to talk. Yeah, but as you have thoughts, just feel free to share.
Maybe I'll just quickly chime in. I mean, if you think about it, right, the space is for everyone. And when you talk about a small place like Singapore, when we have so many competing needs, I think we cannot forget the environment, which is one of the stakeholders, right? We always talk about stakeholders as being people, but the environment is actually a stakeholder, and we do need to consider the environment, because besides the actual benefits we get from it, there's also just the intrinsic value of being there, and I think that's an important aspect. And to be able to bring it all together in an urban environment like Singapore, it's actually a really microcosm of how to make things work. And I think we can see from around the world, it's not easy. It's not easy when you have so many different challenges. And we can see that for every single square meter of land in Singapore, the needs for that 1 square meter, there's so many different groups who want access to it. And how do you manage it so that it's equitable across the different users, but at the same time, still not forgetting that you've got this intangible stakeholder, which is the environment. So I think it is important to ensure that we don't forget any stakeholder when we do this kind of planning. And we also need to bring in people into this conversation. I think when it's just too easy, when everything is just set up, people forget that it actually takes a lot of time and negotiations to get to where we are today. It is not as easy as someone snapping a finger and everything falls into place. There's a lot of compromise that has to occur with us, different agencies, different stakeholders. And I think that is the key element of making anything successful, is to have conversations, to be agreeable to disagree, and to compromise. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Anyone else?
Sure, I can add something. I thought, Nigel, your question was really interesting, and the word integration in it is really interesting. And you gave the example of food security and water scarcity. And I think the great thing about the environment is that it doesn't just give us one thing, right? An engineered structure gives you the thing it's engineered for, primarily. Nature does all of these things. And it does it mostly for free, which is amazing, right? And it can, if you have the right ecosystem in the right place and it's managed correctly, you can get these multiple objectives out of it. So I saw the question on one of the questions on the chat about, we are water scarce and green spaces take up water. And particularly managed green spaces, obviously have a water requirement and maintenance and things. But other types of green spaces can actually, help with water scarcity. They can trap water and stop flooding and slow down water flows. They can clean water. So by the time, that's the reason we have a beautiful forest around the central catchment reservoirs, right? As a water filtration for free. So, but of course that we're not just getting the water services, we are getting the climate services and all the other services that we want. And I think that's, so, the integration part of your question, I think this is really what natural capital, I say it excels at, but it just does it every day, right? It doesn't even try to excel at it. It's just what it is. And that's what we should really try and promote even more.
Thanks, Dan. Anyone else? Hwee, would you like to say something? Don't have to.
I totally agree with what Karen and Dan have said. Yeah. So it's a really complex system. There are different systems operating concurrently, and a solution of one system could be a problem of another. So I think that's to put it loosely, that's the fun of it all. But we get punished for doing wrong things sometimes.
Okay, Jonathan, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think this question of integration is very pertinent when it comes to dealing with a challenge like climate change, right? Because it's something which affects every aspect of society, and it holds challenges not just for the natural environment, but also for infrastructure, for national security, for risk tolerance. And in order to deal with it effectively, we need an integrated approach across all sectors of society and government, right? It can't just be one government agency looking at it. For instance, while PUB is a designated coastal protection agency, because they have the engineering expertise, they also do work with other government agencies who are involved in planning, who have for instance, the ecological background like MParks. And there's also a need to then go beyond government and work with the private sector and with even the average layman, right? Because a challenge as big as this, no single person has the expertise or the knowledge to figure out what the solutions we need. And integrating solutions and inputs from a whole range of different fields, from the humanities and social sciences all the way to hard engineering to ecology, is something that will be a big challenge that we will have to take on in order to adapt to climate change. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. With your indulgence, I know it's 5:30, and yeah, if you can hear in the background this hammering noise, that's a woodpecker next to me making noise. All right. Yeah, we can't do anything about that. That's city in nature for you. I noticed also yeah, with everyone's permission, I'll go on one last question, and it's also sparked a little bit by a question in the chat that talks about the balance between biodiversity and humans, I suppose. And again, it comes back to this fact that we are in a city, right? So there is always got to be this part of the equation that is human. Human beings are part of the equation when we are in this city. So I'd like to sort of bring up a paper that one of our colleagues in NTU, Sean Lam, wrote in Biological Conservation just this year, talking about forest fragments. And like most similar studies, that took a perspective from the plants and the animals' point of view. Okay, fragments cause stress to plants and animals. Yeah, it's basically not a good thing. But I just want to kind of challenge ourselves to see if we can turn the perspective around. What if in Singapore, we can look at ecosystem, not just forests, but ecosystem fragments as oasis of opportunity. So not as much a problem as an opportunity. So can I invite our panelists to each address this from their very different viewpoints? You may not have noticed it, but we actually have a conservation perspective from Karenne and Jonathan. We have a natural capital perspective, as well as a geographer's more broad perspective from Dan. And then we have a planning long-term overview perspective from Hwee. So can I invite the panelists to sort of give us their insights on can we turn this fragmentation of ecosystems around and make it positive? How can we do that? Yeah, thanks.
I guess I can start first. So one of the things that I've shared during my sharing earlier on is about this ecological profiling exercise that MParks is actually undertaking at this moment. So through this exercise, really what we hope to do is actually to defragment the fragmented natural habitats and to actually allow ecological connectivity between the different forest patches, especially those which we have identified to be core areas or source habitats. So this is actually something that we are working on. And of course, we are engaging the nature community and academia as well to actually help us along with some of the technical inputs on this exercise. There have been some talks also about how we could actually manage the wildlife aspect of things once we start turning Singapore into a forest, a jungle. How do we actually manage this wildlife bit of things. So there's something which I think we are also learning as we proceed to understand how humans could actually exist in harmony with nature. So that's something which is sparked off a joke which somebody used to share with me when I first joined Parks, about how someone loved to see butterflies but hate to see caterpillars munching up the leaves at home. So, I mean, for those of us who are very familiar, it's not possible to have butterflies without caterpillars. So a lot of it got to do with education, I think, creating the awareness, creating the conversation, creating the interest, creating conversations from people pro and against certain policies, so that there could be actually a very healthy exchange, and each side can actually understand the story on the other side, and hopefully there could be some balance or some harmony that could arise out of this exchange. So I think a session like this and having researchers on board as well to actually find out more things of the unknown will actually help this whole process for us. Yeah, that's all I got to say. Thanks.
Any others?
Do you want me to go next? Perhaps, yeah.
Well, you volunteered yourself, yes.
Yeah, that's true. I shouldn't have said anything. But thank you, Nigel, for that very interesting question. And I guess, you know, it is not uncommon to view fragmentation as a potential nail in the coffin, right, for biodiversity. And it's not unreasonable view, because fragmentation can cause isolation between fragmented patches. And with growing urbanization around the world, this is a problem that will not go away. So your suggestion of, you know, instead of looking at it negatively to find opportunities is actually quite an interesting approach. And as what Koki mentioned, you know, that is something that we are trying to do at NParks. And I think using opportunities like nature ways, park connectors. So although they are not actual wild areas, so to speak, but they can serve as a conduit between patches. So I think looking at opportunities like that is important. It gives us the ability to then find areas that can naturally connect the biodiversity that we are interested in. So that's the approach we are taking. And I think it has helped, and you can see it for some example animals. I think in the last 10 years or so, suddenly there's a lot more otters around, there's a lot more of these, you know, other species, and they're using these networks of connectors that we created. And I'll just touch very briefly on the marine environment. So unlike the terrestrial, where fragmentation can really isolate, I think in the marine environment, the problem is actually aided by the properties of coastal hydrodynamics, you know, which actually can serve as an effective connector, as well as the reproductive biology of many marine animals that take advantage of this property of hydrodynamics. But even though we know that water connects, there are also hydrodynamic and ecological barriers that we need to understand. And when we do, we can mitigate against that. And just one example is to ensure that there are these ecological stepping stones. If we can identify them and maintain them, then we allow species to actually move from one patch to another through several life cycles, because in one life cycle, they may not be able to move from A to B, but over several life cycles, going through stepping stones, they can reach A to B. So these are some of the things that we are looking at, and these are the opportunities, like you say, you know, within the built environment that we can tap on. Thanks a lot.
Jonathan or Dan?
Yeah. So like when you mentioned that line about fragments being potential oases as well, right? Actually, one thing that we realize about Singapore is that a lot of these smaller fragments, right? They tend to be at an earlier stage in ecological succession. So for instance, recently with Dover Forest, right? It's a relatively small patch, quite young. The forest there is maybe 40, 50 years old at most. But so long as you can maintain some kind of connectivity with for these small fragments, you leave enough time, they can then become colonized by inputs from the bigger core habitats. And then these small fragments start becoming more and more mature patches on their own. And eventually, in their own right, they are very valuable from a biodiversity perspective, as well as from an ecosystem service perspective. So for instance, recently, there was a lot of attention given to Changi Beach, right? Where people were upset at beachgoers digging up biodiversity in the intertidal zone at the seagrass meadow at Changi Beach. But what a lot of people didn't realize was that that stretch is actually reclaimed land. But because it was left alone for about 30 years or so, and because it remained connected to other habitats in Singapore, it then became a mature seagrass meadow, and it's now an oasis of biodiversity that is not just rich from an ecological perspective, it's a valuable source of nature-based recreation for people, right? So when we have all these little fragments scattered here and there, maintaining that connectivity with the big cores is very important, and it allows these little mini paradises almost to emerge in the urban matrix that people can easily access without all having to travel far away to Sungai Buloh, to Bukit Timah. Maybe they can just go to their local neighborhood park because it has been able to mature into a rich forest because of that connection with other places. Yeah.
Okay, Dan, you have some thoughts on this?
Sure. That phrase, oasis of opportunity, I love it. That's great. And I think it's what I think a lot about, because when we normally talk about trade-offs, right, between development and the environment, and I think that's such a blinkered way and quite a historical way of thinking, and it closes our mind when we're thinking about negative trade-offs. It closes our mind to what those opportunities might be. And from a natural capital perspective, for particular benefits or ecosystem services, you may not, fragments are okay, Mangroves are able to store carbon at densities, 3 to 5 times more than other forests. So those little patches are still important, and they're still worth integrating into our land use planning. So fragments can be important for particular services. But I think the one issue about thinking about fragments of oasis of opportunity is that it neglects the rest of the landscape. And I think actually the biggest opportunity is if we flip it around, not that nature is an oasis of opportunity and how we can integrate it into the built environment, but how we can integrate the built environment into nature. And flip it around a little bit. And I think that to me is where I see even more opportunities. So that's my inspiring speech. Thanks.
Thanks for that inspiration, Dan. And actually, without knowing it, when you talked about built environment being flipped around, built environment in nature, that's where in 2011, when we had the city in the garden vision, moving from garden city, that was the paradigm shift that we wanted. And a couple of years ago, we shifted that not just into from a city into a garden, but a city in nature. So yeah, thanks for allowing me to segue back in and to sort of make a pitch for city in nature, which we are pushing very hard, and I hope it's appreciated by people out there. And I also like to, I'd like to thank again the panelists, Dan, Jonathan, Karenne, Hwee, not in order of merit, right? All of them have contributed very much to make this a very interesting discussion. And I want to thank also participants, because a lot of the ideas that came out in the discussion came out because of the questions that you asked. Unfortunately, we of course, as always, don't have time to address all the questions, but we will try to address them later as much as we can. We'll communicate these questions to the appropriate panelists, and we'll see whether we can address those as well. So thank you very much, everyone. It has been a pleasure for me to moderate this session, and I hope it's generated some thoughts for you in the coming days and weeks. Yeah, maybe right now I'd like to move on to the some announcements at the end of the program. So today's webinar, as I mentioned earlier, was part of a series of webinars to share about city in nature. And the next webinar will be held on the 17th of September. Do note that in your diaries. And we will talk about how we can better manage human-nature relationships. I think there were some questions in the chat just now about that. We'll dive a little bit more into that in this webinar. More details will be shared through our EDMs very soon. So we welcome you to join us for that. So besides the series on city in nature, we also have a couple of other webinars on the built environment. And today we talked about that as well. We are very mindful of the fact that we are part of the built environment. And these webinars will talk about environmental productivity as well as test bedding opportunities in the Jurong Lake Gardens. Yeah, these webinars are free, so feel free to sign up and do come for these webinars. We will send you more information in our EDMs. There is a portal where you can learn more about all the upcoming e-Symposia webinars. This is an award-winning, yeah, this morning, the team that organized this e-Symposia got an award. It's a year-long symposia, and there is a portal that you can see there. The QR code is there. We'll show it again at the end as well. So you can read all about the plans for RIE, Research, Innovation and Enterprise 2025. And you can also, if you are in business or you are trying to pursue R&D, there are various innovation support opportunities there as well. And finally, Jonathan brought this up earlier in his presentation. We would like to reiterate Jonathan and Karenne's call for ideas regarding marine, coastal, and climate sciences, right? This is an area that we are focusing deeply on, and we would be glad to hear from you and to work together with you on topics of common interest. I think there was the comment also in the chat about not just government and academia, but also the public, members of the public. So you and I as individuals. So with that, I wish you all a very happy weekend and a happy National Day. Thank you very much.